1. This is part 2 of development. What I'd like to talk about now is Kohlberg and Erikson. Kohlberg is not psychological development so much in that it's moral development. Kohlberg said there were 3 periods of development. The first is pre-conventional, then you have conventional, and post-conventional. So moral development, why do young people do the right thing? Pre-conventional is they do the right thing because they're afraid of punishment. If I do this and I get caught, then someone's going to be angry, there'll be consequences, I should not do this. Not that they don't want to necessarily, right? But that's why they don't. Why do they do the right thing? Because they don't want to be punished. Conventional, and this one, I have a really hard time with this one. According to Kohlberg, adults, in an attempt to have a very orderly, organized society that's safe for everyone, adults agree to abide by certain sort of universal rules or laws in order, because we have all as adults decided, I want to live in a safe society and I want you to be safe and I want to be safe. So we've all agreed, right, to this sort of structure, or you get the idea. In my personal opinion, I don't think that's a real thing at all. I think in many cases the reason why adults do the right thing is the same reason why children do the right thing, because they're afraid of being punished. So I find this, we all have agreed to utopian society kind of thing. I have a hard time believing that. Now, post-conventional is interesting. Post-conventional thinking, which like Freud thought you could get stuck in the first 3 stages and maybe you wouldn't even make latency, is Kohlberg said most people don't get out of the conventional stage. Post-conventional is you have decided for yourself what rules are good rules and that should be upheld, and which rules are bad rules and that you are not going to follow them because they're dumb or they go against some sort of internal. You're not doing it to break the law. You're doing it because you think that that rule is ineffective or bad. So I just want to say it's not anarchy. It's you do agree with most of the rules, but some of the rules you think are just not, we're not made well. The old thing about this person has a relative, maybe it's a wife, maybe it's a family member who's very, very ill. And the idea is there's an experimental medication, you may have heard this one, that could help, but it's not for sale. So the question then becomes, you could steal it, right? But would you? So there is, you could steal it, which you know is wrong, but you are trying to protect the life of a family member. You know, that would probably be worth it to you. That's post-conventional. Now, just as an aside, before I move on to Erikson, is a woman named Carol Gilligan, that's really her name, Carol Gilligan, felt that post-conventional was so mixed up with male-centered thinking that Carol Gilligan said, yes, I kind of agree with the first 2, but the third one is not accurate for all people all the time. And so that's what Carol Gilligan said about post-conventional thinking. Let's move on to Erikson. Erik Erikson was working, he was a contemporary of Freud, so he was working about the same time as Freud was. What's interesting is that Freud only had 5 stages, Erikson has 8. That's better. 8 stages that go into late adulthood, meaning it pretty much, Erikson's stages almost go from birth to death. Well, in fact, they do actually go from birth to death, if you think about it. What's unusual is that the first 5 stages of Erikson occur at about the same time as Freud. So what am I saying? Freud said everything, I should have done this in the other video, I'm so sorry. Okay, development stops at age 12. Well, age 12, that doesn't make any sense. Puberty doesn't even, isn't really even, puberty is going on. How about if we say that? From, say, 11 to 13, so how you, or a little later. How can you say that development stops at 12? Well, if you go backwards in time, quite a long bit, is children were the property of the parents, and in fact the father, and so say something like spousal abuse wasn't really thought of because the male was just utilizing his quote-unquote property in the way, so we're talking about like say the 1800s, and so spousal abuse wasn't really thought of as abuse. You were just being mishandled, I suppose they would say. Not that anybody liked it, but they thought it was not my business, blah, blah, blah. You get the idea. So, and even if you think about even going farther back, when did people get married, right? There's a story about the King of England who I think was in his 20s, and his bride was a French girl at the age of 12. That was marrying age, apparently. So, I don't want you to give Freud too hard a time about stopping development at age 12, because we think about, even in the Industrial Revolution, there were children working in the factories. Why were they working in the factories? Because once you were, old enough to walk, you were old enough to go and get a job and help the family. So, let's go through the first 5. Trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame, initiative versus guilt, industry versus inferiority, and identity versus role confusion. Now, identity versus role confusion, we would think now would be about the teenage years. And I don't mean 13 or 14, but maybe 16 to 18, or maybe 16 to 20. But that's the point where Freud and Erikson kind of end the major development. Well, that means the whole rest of your life. Say, even if we say that stage 5 ends at 20, if you live until 80, that means that the last 3 stages cover like 60 years. So this is called front-loading, is that most of the bulk of the development happens very early. I was going to say real early. Why? Primarily because of this relationship with Freud and working as a cohort. Trust versus mistrust. You either trust that your parents are working in your best interest, or you don't trust. With Erikson, he said you could have a bad outcome, but you could continue to progress through the rest of the stages, which I'm not quite. I don't like the idea that you get stuck in a stage. But what about if you mess up the next one, you mess up the next one, you mess up the next one? Isn't there a cumulative point at which you just can't get any farther? Autonomy versus shame. This would be like sensory motor. You're moving around. You're starting to do things at least a little bit on your own. Initiative versus guilt. This is where you're starting to manipulate your environment. You either can or you cannot. Industry versus inferiority, the 4th stage, this would be going to school. Is you're not only being more independent now, but you're being required to perform by somebody else, that is teachers and young cohorts as well. Like, do you know your ABCs? Do you know your times tables? Blah, 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 blah. So we get to identity versus role confusion. This is where most teenagers would be, according to Erikson. Identity versus role confusion. Why even talk about this? What's the big deal? If you cannot generate your own sense of who you are, then all of your goals, all of the things that you want will be unsatisfying because you are just so basically if you can't come to a conclusion about who you really are, you have to assume someone else's identity. So they're not really making any of their how about if I say they're not making original decisions for themselves? They're copying somebody else. And that in the long run, you'll end up in a relationship that you don't like. You'll end up in a job that you don't like, even if it pays well. Even if that relationship isn't all bad, it will not be satisfying. Intimacy versus isolation is trying to build a long-term, lasting relationship with someone. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean you're getting married, but it means you are in some kind of a long-lasting relationship, trying to build a family. Generativity versus stagnation. Now we're talking about your working years. You are in a career, you're making money, you're doing things with your family, you're building a family. Oh, I'm sorry, let me go back. So intimacy, what's the bad outcome is isolation. You're just by yourself. In generativity versus stagnation, the bad outcome is you're kind of stuck in a dead-end job, you're unfulfilled, and you just don't feel like you're getting anywhere. You don't feel, would be midlife crisis territory. You've never had a motorcycle or a sports car, or you feel like your relationship is not really what you wanted, so you just leave it. Not everyone has midlife crisis. Midlife crisis does not have to happen to you, but if you're not making constructive and quote-unquote original decisions for yourself, you're going to feel like you didn't do the things that you wanted. And then the idea with a midlife crisis, you just feel like, I need to do this right now because otherwise I'll be too old or too decrepit to actually do these things. And the last one is integrity versus despair. This is where you look back on your life and you think, good job. Or you look back on your life and you go, oh dang, right? But now it's too late. Now it's too late to have that midlife crisis because you are in retirement. You're looking back in your life and think, wow, I really messed it up. Or you didn't. You think you did fine.